Good morning. Excuse me. Good morning. I'm Gary Rackliffe from ABB. Enjoyed the invitation to come today, and hopefully the message will be grid focused, but something that'll be relevant to all of you. So I do have two key slides in this deck, and then I decided to surround them with 20 more, just to provide a little bit of perspective. But when I get to the two important slides, I'll make sure that I highlight those as slides that you need to pay attention to. The remainder of the slides I'm going to go through fairly quickly. So I was asked to talk a little bit about grid resilience, and part of grid resilience is responding to storms. We've seen a lot of increase in storm severity as well as frequency of storms in the past few years. If you look at 2017, 3 of the top most costliest storms in the US occurred in that year. And so it's becoming an issue. Certainly everybody is aware of what's going on in California with the fires. East Coast has seen more severe and more frequent hurricanes. And grid resilience and grid hardening are key issues for us. And so grid modernization is addressing some of these issues in terms of blocking and tackling with the grid, hardening the grid where we can put wires underground, elevate substations, we can be more resilient. Also asset renewal, so we don't have problems with failing equipment as well as the storms. Applying automation to isolate faults and disturbances and re-energize as much of the grid as possible, and applying analytics to be better prepared. This slide just shows some of the analytics. We can look at planning, we can look at storms and past storms, and through analytics determine what will be the impact of a forecasted storm. This includes crew preparation as well as staging of equipment, and then actually the situational awareness when a storm hits. Where are the outages? What's the damage? How can we best respond to the damage that has occurred? And then post-event, determining is there any systemic problems and how can we address those? So analytics, artificial intelligence, situational awareness are also part of storm hardening and grid modernization. But I also want to talk about the renewable generation, because as we look at the grid, three major factors, are actually 4. One is the storms, grid hardening, reliability and resiliency. 2 is how do we incorporate renewables? 3 is what's going to happen with electric vehicles? How is that going to impact the grid? And then there's a whole investment wave around digitalization. But here there's a policy driver behind renewable energy. More and more utilities, and I need to update this in September, Duke Energy needs to be added to this list where they mentioned that they will be, I think, 100% or net neutral from carbon by 2050. And the driver behind this are the pathways for greenhouse gas emission reductions. The 50 by 30, which is 50% reduction by 2030, and the 80 by 50, which is the 80% overall reduction by 2050. We see states also supporting this, and we see utilities on the left supporting this as well. So we have a societal, we have an environmental, we have that push behind renewable energy. So just some data, just so you know where we are today. Mark mentioned a little bit about what the generation mix. This is global. On the left, the US is on the right. You can see that coal is decreasing, nuclear is stable, and we see natural gas and renewables increasing in terms of our generation mix. This slide, I think, is kind of interesting. If you look at this over the past 25 years, 95% of our new generation capacity has been either gas or renewable. So if it's coal or if it's nuclear, it's old. And where the investment is in natural gas and in renewables. And in 2018, you can see that the renewable capacity additions to the grid in the US matched the natural grid capacity additions to the grid, and it was a pretty significant year for investment. But I think this is just an interesting trend in terms of where the money is being spent in terms of generation. If you break down the renewable generation, which this slide does, a couple of key things. One, solar is dominating more than wind, but policy matters. If you look at what happened in 2013 to wind, that's when the production tax credit was in jeopardy. Now, we may see a bubble in wind coming up because the production tax credit is scheduled to also end, I think it's the end of this year. And then in 2022, I think the investment tax credit ends for solar. So we may see a bubble in solar approach as well. But this just shows the overall generation mix dominated, in terms of renewables, dominated by the wind and solar. Are we going to see all distributed generation? You know, when we talk about renewables, everybody talks about going off grid, transmission grid is going to go away. I don't believe that. This is global data. It shows on the left the solar PV, what's utility scale versus what's going to be distributed. And typically you hear numbers maybe about 20%, 25% will be distributed, and the balance will be utility scale. We're going to need utility scale renewables if we're going to reach the renewable portfolio standards and the renewable generation needed for carbon reduction. And then on the right, it shows wind, and it shows onshore versus offshore. Offshore is more expensive, although costs are coming down and there's a lot of resource capability. But in the interim, I think onshore is going to dominate. In addition to the environmental push, costs are coming down. So you no longer have to pay a penalty for renewable generation. And so we're seeing at the global level utility scale, both solar and wind, in the $20 per megawatt hour range. And the costs keep coming down. On the right-hand side, we see batteries coming down as well, below $200 per kilowatt hour. That's helping the electric vehicle industry, but it also has benefits for the power industry. But keep a perspective on storage on the grid. 94%, give or take, is pumped hydro. And so even though we talk a lot about battery energy storage, it's still fairly small. And what's interesting, there, in the bids that were submitted, I think it was for the Massachusetts offshore wind, the 1.6 gigawatts, 3 proposals had 3 different storage technologies. One said they were going to use Northfield Mountain, which is a pump storage facility in western Massachusetts. And the other one said they were going to build a big battery at the point of interconnection to the grid where the power came onshore. And then the third one said they were going to use distributed storage. So a number of batteries throughout the grid that were aggregated. So what are the challenges? Okay, so this is an important slide. So this one you want to pay attention to. So on the left, it just shows the load curve. That's the black curve. The red line is the renewable generation. When number 1 is 25% variable renewable energy sources, or the renewable generation. 2 is when you reach 50%. And if you take it all the way to 100% renewables, that's what the third and bottom slide shows. The challenge with that number 3, when we're at 100% renewable, that red portion, that's excess solar. So if you don't have load, and you can't store it, and you don't have transmission capacity to move it someplace else, it gets curtailed. And that's the problem we have with the transmission grid today. It's designed for the existing generation mix. It's not designed for solar or wind located at new places, maybe offshore, maybe up in North Dakota. So we have transmission limitations. And if we have enough capacity in renewable resources, in quote, to meet all the load, it may not be produced at the right time because you can't dispatch renewable generation. You have to take it when it's available. We don't have enough storage in the grid, and we have transmission constraints. And what that means is you reach a saturation effect where as you add more renewable generation, you don't get an equal benefit in kilowatt hours delivered. And that means there's less of a return on investment, and it's going to be a challenge for us. And you can see the right side of that just shows, even if you have renewable generation that reaches 200% of the amount of generation delivered to meet load, you still can't get there because of the constraints in the transmission grid to be able to move that power around, the lack of storage, and the lack of mismatch between load and wind variable renewable resources. Wind, principally at night, solar in the middle of the afternoon, are generating. And the net result is you end up with curtailment. So we're going to have a real challenge in trying to meet the goals of 2050 if we don't make investment in the transmission grid. So that's my key point. point. This is the California duck curve. It's been around since 2013, but the key point is, for those who are not familiar with it, the 2012 is existing load with no renewables. The subsequent years show more and more renewable generation being added, particularly solar. And what happens at 2020, if you don't have enough base load generation to meet the ramp, which is a 13 gigawatt ramp, you're going to have insufficient power. You need the base load generation. So 2020, you see a push. Either you curtail base load generation, or you curtail the solar, which leads to less efficiency. And this just shows the mismatch. And that ramp is based on having some base load generation, ramping generation, and imports. And so the generation mix becomes very important. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to go fast. At the distribution level, knowing what's on the distribution grid is really important. Situational awareness is important. Being able to better forecast is important. You can also get curtailment at the distribution level. If you have a large solar facility on a distribution feeder under light loads, you get reverse power flow. That raises the voltages on the feeder, and you may lead to curtailment. So what are solutions? We can build transmission. Texas is a very good use case. You can see on the chart on the right the curtailments that occurred before the transmission was available in Texas, and also negative pricing. And you can see both curtailment and the pricing is more stable once the transmission was added. So transmission does matter. We now have over 20 gigawatts of wind. At the distribution level, we're seeing microgrids and storage. The different use cases, there's 8 different use cases. They're summarized as the 8 S's on the right side of this slide. But these can be pancaked to provide additional value and help manage renewable generation and some of the stability and requirements on the grid. And then we have software. ADMS is advanced distribution software. It was initially deployed at utilities to support outage management in the control room. Distribution SCADA was added in, which is shown at the top, and then advanced applications, which include volt-var control and management, also automated switching for reliability. But now with distributed energy resources at the grid edge, we're adding DERMS, which is distributed energy management software, to do aggregation, forecasting, dispatch, settlement, establish markets at the distribution level. So these software solutions are now being primarily piloted, but hopefully will be mainstream soon. So this is my second important slide. So you need to pay attention to this one as well. So for years, we've been trying to reduce peak demand. The most expensive generation occurs or is dispatched during peak. And so if we can eliminate peak demand, we can save a whole lot of money on generation capacity costs. But now we're changing a little bit. Still need to reduce peak demand. I think that's important, but we need to be looking at when is the generation available when we have non-dispatchable resources such as renewable generation. And so what's shown in the middle is just using electric vehicle demand to illustrate the point. What's shown in the light blue is the actual load curve with a fair amount of EV charging, which is occurring in the evening based on timer, where at 11 o'clock or around that time, all the EV charging is triggered. And so you're actually creating, under this scenario, new peak demand. But if you could shift that demand to, which is shown in the dark blue, to match solar PV in the afternoon and wind later at night, you still have peak demands, but you're matching that with your renewable generation resources. Remember, when you have renewable generation, you need to either have load that can consume it, transmission that can move it, or storage that can save it or store it. And being able to do that, I think, is important. And then time of use rates, that's just really a proxy. I think what's different today, as we go forward, we need to be looking at how we manage demand. Historically, we've dispatched generation to match our demand profile. We need to switch that around. We need to think about, can we dispatch demand to match the variable renewable sources when they're generating power? And that's a real paradigm shift. And so that's my second key point. We need to be able to manage demand better and proactively shift demand to match renewable generation resources. And then we also need the transmission. And so just my conclusion, weather events are more frequent, more severe, and we are adding renewable generation. If you don't think it's going to happen, you're kidding yourself. With the policy push and the economic push, it's happening. And utilities are going to need to manage this. And then we also, I talked about making sure that we can, or looking forward, can we shift demand to match the dispatch or the availability of renewable generation resources. And so this is my email address. I don't know if the presentation will be available, but if not, you can write this down real quick and I'll send you a copy of the presentation. Thank you.